They called him a hero, others a monster. Now he's in The Hague. How did this happen? March 11th, 2025. Rodrigo Duterte, former president of the Philippines, once hailed by supporters as the man who would end crime with an iron fist, was arrested at Manila's international airport after returning from a private trip to Hong Kong. Quiet, no media frenzy, just a convoy, a warrant, and handcuffs. The arrest wasn't local, it was global, ordered by the International Criminal Court, enforced by the Philippine National Police, backed by Interpol. Duterte stands accused of crimes against humanity linked to a brutal anti-drug campaign that left thousands dead. For years, he mocked the idea that he could ever be touched. He even withdrew the Philippines from the ICC in 2019. But international law doesn't forget. The court retains jurisdiction for crimes committed before the withdrawal. Now, at 79 years old, the man once called the Punisher faces the one thing he thought he could outrun: justice. For the first time in history, an Asian head of state has been arrested under ICC authority. This isn't just another trial. It's a test of whether global justice actually means something or if it only applies to the weak. Rodrigo Roa Duterte was never just another politician. Before becoming president, he was the longtime mayor of Davao City, a city that went from being crime-ridden in the 1980s to one of the so-called safest cities in Asia under his rule. But that transformation came with blood in the gutters. Duterte openly endorsed vigilante justice, often boasting that he would kill criminals with his own hands if needed. In 2016, he rode a wave of frustration and fear straight into the presidency. He wasn't polished, he wasn't diplomatic. He cursed in speeches, threatened criminals on live TV, and promised one thing above all: a Philippines free of drugs, even if it meant thousands of bodies. His campaign slogan was simple: change is coming. And it did fast and brutally. Millions voted for him, not because they didn't know who he was, but because they did. They believed he would bring order. And for a time, he did through fear, force, and a promise. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. But if you're not, I'll deal with you personally. When Rodrigo Duterte launched his war on drugs in 2016, he didn't hold back. His message was clear: if you destroy my country with drugs, I will kill you. And thousands died. According to human rights groups, over 12,000 people were killed during official anti-drug operations. Some estimates go even higher. The Philippine National Police say many of those killed were armed suspects who fought back, a phrase so common it became a grim acronym: Nanlaban, resisted arrest. But witnesses often told a different story of midnight raids, masked men, victims dragged from homes, shot unarmed, no trials, no second chances. The United Nations and the International Criminal Court both flagged these patterns as signs of extrajudicial executions, killings carried out without legal process. The victims were rarely drug lords. Most were poor, street-level users, small-time dealers, or people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. In Manila's slums and alleyways, fear became routine. Bodies were left with cardboard signs reading, "I'm a pusher, don't be like me." It was terror used as policy, and for years it was unchecked, until now. While human rights groups and foreign governments condemned Rodrigo Duterte's drug war back home, he was a political rock star. To the international community, he was a populist strongman running a campaign soaked in blood. But to millions of Filipinos, he was the president who finally did something. He spoke their language, blunt, unapologetic, aggressive. He didn't just promise law and order, he delivered it, or at least the image of it. Even as international media labeled him a human rights violator, his domestic approval ratings stayed sky high. At multiple points during his presidency, polls showed over 70% of Filipinos supported him. In some surveys, it was even higher. He was especially popular among the working class and residents of urban areas plagued by crime and drugs. To them, he wasn't a dictator, he was a protector. This deep-rooted support made him politically untouchable for years. It also made it easier for institutions to stay quiet. After all, how do you hold someone accountable when most of the country still calls him a hero? The International Criminal Court didn't rush into this case. It moved slowly, carefully because it had to. In February 2018, the ICC Office of the Prosecutor announced a preliminary examination into allegations of crimes against humanity during Duterte's war on drugs. They began collecting documents, survivor accounts, and reports from human rights organizations. But almost immediately, Duterte lashed out. He accused the ICC of insulting the sovereignty of the Philippines. 1 month later, in a defiant move, he withdrew the country from the Rome Statute, the treaty that created the ICC. But here's the catch: international law doesn't let a country erase the past. The ICC clarified that it retains jurisdiction over crimes committed while the Philippines was still a member, which includes nearly all of Duterte's presidency from 2016 until the withdrawal took effect in 2019. From that point on, a quiet legal battle began building behind the scenes. Investigators kept gathering evidence, survivors kept telling their stories, and Duterte kept dismissing it all as a Western conspiracy. But justice in this case wasn't about speed, it was about patience, and the ICC was playing the long game. Behind closed doors in The Hague, a mountain of evidence was slowly being built piece by piece, year by year. The ICC didn't just rely on news headlines or activist reports. They pulled from a wide range of sources: autopsy reports, police blotters, surveillance footage, first-hand witness testimony from families, survivors, and even former officers who broke ranks. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch submitted detailed dossiers, alleging that many killings followed a chilling pattern. Unannounced nighttime raids, unarmed suspects shot point blank, crime scenes manipulated after the fact. The most damning claim? That the campaign of violence wasn't just tolerated by the state, it was encouraged. Prosecutors argue there was a systematic policy rooted at the highest levels of government to eliminate drug suspects without due process, and that makes it more than just a crime spree. It qualifies under international law as a crime against humanity. This wasn't a few rogue cops going too far. This was, in the ICC words, a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population, which means it was organized, it was state-backed, and it wasn't accidental. For years, Rodrigo Duterte dismissed the ICC as powerless. He joked that if they tried to arrest him, he'd slap the judges. He called the court useless, hypocritical, and foreign interference. But then came March 11th, 2025, the day everything changed. That morning, Duterte returned to the Philippines from a private trip to Hong Kong. As his plane landed at Ninoy Aquino International Airport, he was met not by supporters or security detail, but by officers from the Philippine National Police, accompanied by Interpol agents. Armed with an arrest warrant issued by the ICC, they moved in quickly and without incident. There was no grand spectacle, no media frenzy, no dramatic standoff, just a former head of state silent, surrounded, and escorted into custody. The arrest shocked the world not just because it happened, but because it was allowed to happen. For years, critics believed Duterte would never be touched, that the system would always protect him. But now that shield was gone. He was flown under high security to The Hague, Netherlands, the seat of the International Criminal Court, where he would await formal charges and trial. It was a historic moment. the first time an Asian head of state had ever been arrested and transferred to the ICC for prosecution. What had once seemed impossible was now real. Rodrigo Duterte, the man who once ruled a nation by fear, now stood on foreign soil, waiting to face judgment. Duterte now finds himself inside the walls of Scheveningen prison, the ICC detention center in The Hague, far from the heat, the crowds, and the loyal supporters of Manila. It's a cold, clinical space, secure, isolated, designed for high-profile detainees facing the full weight of international law. His trial, overseen by a panel of international judges, is expected to unfold in phases over months, possibly years. But the process has already begun. He stands charged with crimes against humanity, including murder as part of a widespread attack against civilians, persecution on political and social grounds, and other inhumane acts carried out as part of official policy. Under ICC rules, Duterte has the right to a fair and public trial, legal representation, and the ability to present evidence and witnesses. He will be allowed to speak if he chooses, but the court's focus will remain on patterns, intent, and command responsibility. This trial isn't about a single murder. It's about whether Duterte used the power of the presidency to orchestrate or tolerate mass killings. If convicted, he faces life imprisonment served not in the Philippines, but in an international correctional facility. The ICC does not use the death penalty. The world will be watching. So will his victims. And so will future leaders wondering, if he can be put on trial, could I be next? Even before his arrest, Rodrigo Duterte had been preparing his narrative. For years, he mocked the ICC authority, claiming it had no jurisdiction over him. He argued that the Philippines was a sovereign nation and that foreign courts had no right to interfere in its domestic affairs. His legal team echoed this, calling the case politically motivated and designed to embarrass him on the global stage. Duterte's defense rests on three major claims. Everything was legal. He insists the drug war was conducted under Philippine law. According to him, the police were acting within their authority, and any deaths were the result of lawful self-defense. He never ordered any killings. Duterte argues that if abuses happened, they were committed by rogue officers acting on their own. He denies ever giving orders to kill suspects without due process. The ICC has no power here. His lawyers continue to argue that since the Philippines formally withdrew from the ICC in 2019, the court has no standing to prosecute him. But the ICC maintains jurisdiction for crimes committed before that withdrawal became official. In one televised speech before his arrest, Duterte even said, "If going to prison is the price I have to pay to protect my people, then so be it." To his supporters, it was the ultimate act of self-sacrifice. To his critics, it was performance. A final attempt to rewrite the story before the court writes it for him. Behind every statistic in Duterte's drug war is a shattered family, a missing father, a silenced teenager, a mother who still wakes up hoping it was all a mistake. One of the most haunting stories is that of Cain de los Santos, a 17-year-old student killed during a police raid in 2017. CCTV footage contradicted the police report. Witnesses said Cain was dragged into an alley, handed a gun, and shot in the head while begging for his life. "Please stop," he reportedly cried. "I have a test tomorrow." His case sparked rare protests, brief moments when the silence cracked. But Cain was not alone. There were thousands like him. People killed in alleyways, under bridges, inside their homes, often with no warning, no warrant, no crime proven. Most were poor. Most never had a lawyer. Many were never even named. Mothers were left to identify bodies at the morgue, often paying bribes just to claim them. Children grew up fatherless, families too afraid to speak, fearing they'd be next. The ICC case isn't built on headlines, it's built on testimonies. Real people, real pain, and a common thread. They never got justice at home. Now, in a courtroom thousands of miles away, their voices might finally be heard. The arrest of Rodrigo Duterte didn't just send shockwaves through international law, it set off a political earthquake in the Philippines. For years, Duterte had been the axis around which Philippine politics revolved. Even after his presidency ended in 2022, his influence never truly faded. His daughter, Sara Duterte, became vice president. His allies held key positions in Congress. His name still carried weight in every election. But once the ICC warrant was executed, fault lines appeared. Some lawmakers and former officials publicly applauded the arrest, calling it a long overdue reckoning. Human rights groups staged vigils and rallies, holding up photos of victims and signs reading, "Justice is not revenge." Others, especially his loyalists, lashed out. They claimed the arrest was a foreign conspiracy, an attempt by Western powers to humiliate the Philippines. Several senators warned it could lead to political instability, while pro-Duterte news outlets called it a betrayal by the state. Even President Bongbong Marcos, a former ally of Duterte, was caught in the middle. His official statements were vague, calling for calm and respect for legal processes, but avoiding direct support or condemnation. Behind the scenes, political alliances began to shift. Duterte's arrest weakened the hold his family once had over national politics, and with his daughter's presidential ambitions now under a shadow, the once dominant Duterte dynasty is suddenly vulnerable. The message was clear. No one is untouchable, not even in their own backyard. The world didn't stay silent when Rodrigo Duterte was arrested, it roared. Leaders, legal experts, and human rights organizations from across the globe weighed in. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called the arrest a historic breakthrough for international justice. Amnesty International declared it a moment of vindication for thousands of families who had been waiting, often in silence, for someone to finally be held accountable. In Europe, several parliaments praised the move as a milestone in enforcing international law, especially against state leaders accused of violence against their own people. The Netherlands, home to the ICC, reaffirmed its support for a justice system that transcends borders. But not every country applauded. China and Russia offered no comment, neither condemning nor endorsing the arrest. Some political analysts suggested that both nations, who have also been criticized for human rights abuses, were watching closely, but staying quiet for a reason. Meanwhile, the United States treaded carefully. While us officials expressed support for the ICC efforts, they stopped short of celebrating Duterte's arrest, mindful of their own complex history with the court. In Southeast Asia, reactions were mixed. Some leaders worried the arrest could set a precedent that might one day be used against them. Others, particularly in Cambodia and Indonesia, issued cautious statements emphasizing non-interference in regional politics. But globally, one thing was clear. The arrest of Rodrigo Duterte was not just about one man. It was a signal that the age of impunity might be ending. As the trial looms, a fundamental question is dividing public opinion, not just in the Philippines, but around the world. Is this true justice, or is it political theater? Supporters of Duterte claim the case is driven by Western bias. They argue that the ICC focuses disproportionately on leaders from developing countries while turning a blind eye to similar or worse actions by powerful nations. To them, this trial is not about justice, it's about shaming a sovereign country for choosing a different path. They ask, where were these same courts when drone strikes killed civilians? when military occupations caused mass suffering. But victims and their families tell a different story. To them, this isn't a stunt. This is survival. This is a court finally listening after their own justice system failed them for nearly a decade. Critics of Duterte believe this case is the first time real consequences are being applied to a leader who used state power to erase due process and silence dissent. And while the ICC may not be perfect, they say, it's the only global courtroom capable of holding leaders accountable when no one else will. In the middle of this argument sits the truth. This trial is about more than Duterte. It's about testing the limits of international justice. It's about asking whether anyone, even the most popular, the most powerful, can truly be above the law. Duterte's arrest didn't just rattle Southeast Asia, it shook the entire foundation of global power. Until now, the International Criminal Court has mostly pursued leaders from war-torn regions, militia commanders, or presidents of collapsing states. But Duterte, he wasn't hiding in a jungle. He wasn't overthrown. He stepped down peacefully. He lived openly. He remained politically influential. That's what makes this different. This case sets a global precedent that even elected, popular, and still powerful leaders can be held accountable for what they do while in office. It opens the door legally and symbolically for other ongoing investigations into sitting or former leaders accused of crimes against their own people. That includes high-profile cases involving Vladimir Putin over alleged war crimes in Ukraine, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad for chemical attacks on civilians, Sudanese generals tied to ethnic massacres. If the ICC succeeds in convicting Duterte, it may embolden prosecutors in other cases where evidence has stalled for years, not because the crimes were unclear, but because the political power behind them seemed untouchable. And more than that, it sends a message to future leaders. The world is watching, and history has teeth. Because if someone like Duterte can face justice, anyone can. The courtroom in The Hague is a world away from Philippine politics, a place where charisma doesn't matter, and every word is recorded, every claim weighed, every piece of evidence challenged. Rodrigo Duterte will sit in front of a panel of 3 ICC judges chosen for impartiality and international legal experience. He will be represented by defense counsel, while the Office of the Prosecutor presents its case built on years of investigations, thousands of documents, and testimony from victims, police insiders, and legal experts. This isn't a short trial. ICC proceedings are notoriously slow and complex. They move through multiple stages. Pre-trial hearings to confirm the charges. Full trial where evidence is debated and witnesses are examined. Appeals which could stretch on for years if a conviction is handed down. Duterte will not be treated as guilty from the start. In fact, ICC procedure leans heavily toward protecting the rights of the accused. He'll be given every chance to defend himself, to speak, to bring in experts, even to challenge the court's jurisdiction. But the weight of the case is immense. Dozens of witnesses are expected to testify, some anonymously, for their own safety. Survivors will recount what happened when police entered their homes. Former insiders may break silence, and prosecutors will work to prove one central argument: that these killings were not random. They were organized, encouraged, and enabled by Duterte himself. The world will be watching, and inside that quiet courtroom, the battle between power and accountability will play out one fact at a time. To understand how Rodrigo Duterte ended up in an international courtroom, we have to trace the story year by year, a timeline not of dates, but of dread. 2016, Duterte wins the Philippine presidency by a landslide. He immediately launches his war on drugs. Within weeks, bodies begin turning up in the streets. Most are poor. most are nameless. 2017-2018 killings escalate. Human rights groups document thousands of deaths. The international press begins reporting the violence. In February 2018, the ICC opens a preliminary examination. Duterte responds by announcing the country's withdrawal from the ICC. 2019, the Philippines officially exits the Rome Statute, but the ICC confirms it still has jurisdiction for alleged crimes committed before the withdrawal took effect. 2020-2022 investigations continue. The Duterte administration downplays the death toll. Domestic courts largely stay silent. One rare exception: the conviction of 3 officers for the murder of teenager Cain de los Santos. 2022, Duterte steps down. His daughter, Sara Duterte, becomes vice president. He fades from the spotlight, but the ICC does not. 2023-2024, behind the scenes, the ICC builds its case. Witnesses are contacted. Police documents are analyzed. Survivor accounts are gathered from years of silence. March 11, 2025, Duterte returns from a private trip abroad. He is arrested at the Manila airport by Philippine authorities and Interpol, acting on an ICC warrant. Today, he sits in a detention cell in The Hague, awaiting trial. 9 years, thousands of lives lost. One man, once untouchable, now stands trial. The timeline may be long, but justice, some say, has finally caught up. If Rodrigo Duterte is found guilty, the outcome will be nothing short of historic. He would become the first former Asian head of state to be convicted by the International Criminal Court. The sentence, most likely life imprisonment served in one of the ICC-designated facilities, often in European countries like Norway or the United Kingdom. But beyond the punishment, a conviction would send a thunderclap across global politics. Inside the Philippines, it could trigger massive political fallout. His allies, many still in office, might face pressure, investigations, or even legal exposure themselves. The Duterte political dynasty, already shaken, could unravel entirely. It would also affect international relationships. Countries that supported Duterte diplomatically or quietly looked the other way during his presidency might now face scrutiny for complicity or silence. And for the victims' families, it would be a long-awaited acknowledgement, proof that their pain was real, that the world didn't forget, that justice, though late, arrived. But there's another layer. A conviction would raise the bar for international law. It would prove that popular leaders, not just warlords or failed dictators, can face real consequences. It would embolden future ICC prosecutors to pursue similar cases. And it would leave a lasting legacy, that no matter how powerful you once were, you don't get to write the final chapter, not if the world chooses to write it for you. But what if Duterte isn't convicted? It's a possibility that looms over the entire case, and one that carries its own kind of consequences. If the judges find that the prosecution didn't prove its case beyond reasonable doubt, or if legal technicalities around jurisdiction hold weight, Duterte could be acquitted. He would return to the Philippines no longer as a fugitive, but as a man who survived the world's highest court. To his supporters, it would be vindication. Proof that everything was a witch hunt. They would celebrate his freedom as a victory not just for him, but for national sovereignty. His legacy, instead of being stained by a conviction, might actually be strengthened. But for the families of the victims, for human rights advocates, and for the international community, it would be devastating. An acquittal could send a chilling message that even with evidence, even with international outrage, even with years of effort, justice is not guaranteed. It could discourage future prosecutions. It could undermine the ICC credibility, and it could embolden other leaders accused of similar crimes to act without fear of consequences. More dangerously, it could deepen the divide in Philippine society. Those who already lost faith in institutions might lose it completely, and for survivors, it would feel like the system failed them again. The ICC isn't just deciding one man's fate, it's deciding whether global justice has teeth or whether it's just a symbol we invoke when it's convenient. Rodrigo Duterte's arrest has opened a door, and now the world is staring into it. Because if an elected president from a functioning democracy can be detained and put on trial for crimes against humanity, then who's safe? That's the question haunting world leaders, especially those accused of violence within their own borders. And it's not just autocrats in fragile states anymore. It's heads of powerful nations, politicians with global influence, leaders with armies, nuclear stockpiles, and allies. Names like Vladimir Putin, already under an ICC warrant for alleged war crimes in Ukraine, or Bashar al-Assad, whose forces have been accused of chemical attacks against civilians in Syria. Even democratic leaders have come under fire for drone strikes, targeted assassinations, or war policies that blurred the line between legal combat and civilian slaughter. So now the world waits, because the ICC has shown it's willing to go after the unthinkable, not just warlords in exile, but presidents in power, politicians with popularity, people who thought they were above the law. And as this trial moves forward, every one of them will be watching closely. Because today it's Duterte, but tomorrow it could be them. Rodrigo Duterte once ruled through fear. His words were weapons, his policies brutal, his popularity unshakable. He believed power protected him, that the law bowed to him, that history would favor the strong, not the just. But now he sits in a cell in The Hague, no longer flanked by bodyguards, no longer commanding headlines, just one man aged alone, facing a courtroom that doesn't answer to him. This isn't just a trial, it's a test. Can justice really reach those at the top? Can the international community hold a leader accountable not after a regime collapses, but while his legacy still casts a shadow? And what does it mean for a country to face its own reflection without blinking? This story isn't over. The trial hasn't even begun. But what happens next will echo far beyond one courtroom, one country, or one man. Because this isn't just about Rodrigo Duterte. It's about what kind of world we're willing to accept, and what kind of world we still believe is possible. So now you know the story, not just the headlines, but the system, the silence, and the screams behind it. Rodrigo Duterte isn't just facing judges, he's facing history. And whether he walks free or is locked away forever, one truth remains: the world is watching. And the victims, they're finally being heard. If this case made you think even for a second about power, pain, and what justice should look like, don't stay silent. Comment below. Do you think this trial is real justice or just a global show? Subscribe for more true stories that challenge everything we think we know about power and consequence. And if you believe truth deserves a voice, share this video. Because justice begins with awareness. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is watch. And remember,